Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our conversation with Woody Holton about his wonderful new book, Liberty is Sweet, A Hidden History of the American Revolution. I'm Patty Miller, editor of Encyclopedia Virginia, and I'll be hosting today's conversation. And we'd also like to thank the Library of Virginia for co-hosting this event today. We would just also like to take a moment to acknowledge and offer our condolences from everyone here at Encyclopedia Virginia and Virginia Humanities on the passing of Woody's father, former Virginia Governor Linwood Holton. There's a wonderful obituary in the Washington Post today. If you'd like to know more about Linwood's career, he was an amazing Virginian who contributed a lot to the moving Virginia into the 20th century, I guess we could say. And I'm also going to drop into the chat Encyclopedia Virginia's entry about Linwood Holton and his career, one of our collection of what I think is probably the best collection of biographies of Virginia governors in existence. So we're obviously proud to have Linwood Holton among those folks that we profile on Encyclopedia Virginia. Encyclopedia Virginia, for people who are not familiar with it, is a free, reliable multimedia resource on the history and culture of Virginia that seeks to understand how all Virginians have contributed to the history of Virginia. So it's really appropriate that we're talking to Woody today about his book, which also seeks, I think, as he said recently in an interview, to move the stories of African Americans and Native Americans and women from the back of the chapter of the book of the American Revolution, integrated into the whole story of the revolution. So I encourage you to pick up a copy of the book. I hope today's conversation only whets your appetite to read more about this, what Woody calls the hidden history of the revolution. And I'm also dropping into the chat a link to the bookstore.org page where you can buy your very own copy of Liberty is Sweet. A couple of notes before we begin. We will have time for a Q&A, so please use the Q&A function to ask any questions. And this event does have closed captioning, so you can turn that on and customize that in your Zoom settings if you'd like to use that. So without further ado, I'm so pleased to introduce Woody Holton. Woody is the McCausland Professor of History at the University of South Carolina, where he teaches and researches early American history with a focus on the American Revolution, economic history, and on African Americans, Native Americans, and women. He is the author of Abigail Adams, which was awarded the Bancroft Prize, and Unruly Americans and the Origins of the Constitution, which was a finalist for the National Book Award. Woody is also an advisor for Encyclopedia Virginia's upcoming section on the American Revolution in Virginia, and we're really thrilled to be working with him on that and ask you to stay tuned over the next couple of years as we unveil a series of entries that really talk about the American Revolution more as a participatory event among all Virginians, not just among the elite white Virginians that are often foregrounded in conversations about the Revolution. So on that note, Woody, let me ask you, you went to public school here in Virginia. What did you learn about the American Revolution as a student, and how did that inform the work that you do now?
I'd say the biggest thing I learned wasn't specifically about the revolution, but simply by going to public school, because I'll tell you, Patty, that I went to elementary school in Roanoke, and this was was a decade after the Brown versus Board of Education decision, but I went to a completely segregated all-white elementary school because that's pretty much all there was. But then when Dad was governor, and I appreciate your very kind words about him, when he was governor in 1970, the courts finally said, okay, Virginia schools, no more fooling around, you got to really integrate. And so I went from going to a literally all white school to an almost all black school. And it was a great experience. You know, they did it because separate was inherently unequal, but it ended up being, I think, a real benefit to all of those who went through that experience. It was a bizarre experience for me, having many friends who were very poor, candidly, but also represented a wide range of everything but governor's son. And here I am going home to this mansion. But you know, there's all these experiences I never would have had if I hadn't gone to Mosby Middle School, it was called, named after a Confederate raider. It's renamed, and maybe somebody will write in on the chat to remind me, but It's got a new name. It might be Malcolm X. It's named after an African-American hero, and I can't remember which one now, long after I was there. But so I'd say the biggest thing I learned that informs my study of the revolution was just about the beautiful diversity of Virginia and of all of the 12 colonies that rebelled, 13 colonies that rebelled, the 12 others, and really all 26. People forget Britain had 26 colonies in America in 1776, not 13. And then when you look at all of them, plus the numerous native nations, people have counted them up as 500 native nations just in North America. It is a real mosaic, and that was a fun thing for me to write about.
Let's begin at the beginning a little bit. You begin your story not with, as you know, many stories about the revolution often do, with the Stamp Act of 1765, but with the Battle of the Monongahela in 1755. So talk a little bit about why you started there and how that helps foreground the contribution and the effects of the native nations on the revolution.
Right. Well, it's partly Virginia bias because the Monongahela River is actually mostly in Pennsylvania, but at the time, people like George Washington claimed that area as beyond Pittsburgh, in fact, as part of Virginia. So I showed my Virginia bias by starting the book in what white Virginians claimed as their own, but it was also claimed by the Shawnees and Delawares and the Mingos, who were an offshoot of the Iroquois, and by the French. And so Pittsburgh was the place to be. Everybody wanted to be there. They were sort of all converging with their interests, and it becomes the flashpoint for the French and Indian War, whether you start it in 1754, when Washington went out there to try to drive the French off and got driven off himself, or in 1755, when I did, with this battle that was an absolute disaster for the British, which included Washington. This was back when he was a very loyal subject of his king, and he fought in that battle alongside a man named Thomas Gage, who would later be commander-in-chief of British forces in North America at the start of the Revolution. So on the opposite side from George Washington. So it was almost like a brother against brother story to have these two brother officers getting to know each other and becoming friendly during the previous war, and then leading the opposing armies in the Revolutionary War. But it wasn't just those two. I found 7 Continental officers, that is, officers who would be leaders on the Patriot side in the Revolutionary War, who fought at the Battle of the Monongahela. So it was sort of the formative experience for that generation, in the same way that World War I would be for people in the 20s and 30s, until World War II became the formative. It really formed these people. And it also makes a point. I mentioned that in the prologue to the book, and the prologue is called Hidden Enemies, because it wasn't the French who wiped out that British army on July 9th, 1755. There were a few French soldiers there, but the vast majority of the people, and the really effective people who destroyed Braddock's army, were Native Americans. And so them being hidden enemies fits with my post-colon part of my title, the hidden history of the revolution. That battle would have gone completely differently if Native Americans hadn't been there. And I don't speak of it counterfactually much in the book, but that's sort of the point I'm making all the way through. For instance, if I keep talking about Native Americans for a second, the French won that. I'm sorry, the French initially were winning in the war, but the British eventually won the French and Indian War in a big way, but it had doubled their debt, and they didn't want to have to fight Indians again in the future. And I've got a V-22 going over at Osprey. I apologize. I think that's what that is. Well, we'll just let it go. Anybody want to look at an airplane? Oh, it's a helicopter. Sorry. Live. This is what happens when you do it live.
This is not recorded.
I'd ask you to talk, but I couldn't hear you either. He's almost gone. The French and Indian War doubled the British debt, and along comes the Stamp Act. And a lot of textbooks still make this mistake of saying the purpose of the Stamp Act was to help pay off that British debt from the 7 Years' War. It wasn't. It was to prevent additional expenses, because the main thing the Stamp Act did, well, the only thing the Stamp Act did was fund 10,000 troops that the British left in America after that war, the bulk of whom were put on the western border of Virginia and neighboring colonies to try to prevent another war between the Native Americans and the colonists, because the Britain, as I said, didn't want to pay for that war. And so I would say here too, had there been no Indians, there would have been no Stamp Act. And if people know one thing about the American Revolution, it's no taxation without representation. But you never think about, well, are Native Americans part of that? But I really think they were.
And I think that's a fascinating point. And the other point, maybe we could just, since we're kind of on this topic a little bit, talk a little bit, and I know you are an economic historian, is you really argue that economics played as much a part in this as you talk about the four T's, about taxation, territory, treasury bills, and trade. And talk a little bit about the debtor-creditor situation and how you see economics also really influencing the course of the revolution.
Okay, great. So thank you for mentioning my four T's. I think it's helpful for my students. It is for me anyway. And you've mentioned, we've talked about two of them already. Territory, because the British were passed an act called the Proclamation Line of 1763, allowing the Native Americans to keep all of the land west of the Appalachian Mountains. So that is a big part of modern day Virginia, that, in fact, where my father's from, that would have been in Indian territory, as well as Kentucky, which Virginia claimed for a long time, and West Virginia, which of course they didn't lose until 1863. All of that would have been part of, would have remained in Indian territory. And again, the British didn't do that out of kindness to the Indians, but because they didn't want to get into another war with them. But you asked about debt. This takes me all the way back to a book that I published in 1999. It was my dissertation about the huge role of debt. Virginians owed 4 million pounds sterling to British merchants on the eve of the Revolution. And I got to say, when I first started looking into that, I go, oh, they owed all this money, and then they fought a revolution, and most of them never end up having to pay those debts. And so I kind of agreed with the really cynical debunking historians who said, aha, they rebelled in order to get out of paying their debts. But that's not where I ended up. Where I ended up was, you know, that the big crop in those days was tobacco, and the tobacco had gone into a terrible recession in 1772, and it finally snapped out of that recession, and tobacco prices went way up in 1774. But that was not just the market, you know, the cycles of the market. That was deliberate action on the part of white Virginia colonists who announced that they were going to withhold their tobacco shipments to Britain, not right now, but next year. And you know, whenever you say you're going to stop supplying a commodity a year from now, the price of it goes up as people scramble to get it. And people did that. And so that debt went from 4 million pounds sterling to 2 million pounds sterling in a little over a year, just by the price of tobacco going up. And here's the point. This economic mode of withholding tobacco in order to drive up the price, that had been out there for decades, and people had tried it, but it had never really worked until the tobacco growers mixed their economic goal of driving up their prices with a political goal. They were protesting what Britain was doing to Boston, closed the port of Boston, passed all these laws called the Coercive Acts, punishing Massachusetts for the Boston Tea Party. And the Virginians were clever enough to say, if we withhold our tobacco from Britain, that will A, be a good form of protest. You know, boycotts, people do boycotts all the time. And B, it'll drive up the price of our weed.
So it's a really interesting, you know, and I really, when I was reading your book, I kept thinking it's a kaleidoscope. You see how economics influences this and how Indians influence this. None of these things can obviously be separated out from the other thing, but they all are important on their own. One of the more contentious to some assertions you've made in your book, and we'll talk about it because we are in Virginia, is Lord Dunmore's proclamation is another very formative thing on the white elite of Virginia. And for people who aren't familiar with Lord Dunmore's proclamation, which offered, he was the last royal governor of Virginia, offered emancipation to slaves, as you note, of people who were in rebellion against the crown, not all enslaved people, if they would fight for the crown. I will drop in the chat a link to Encyclopedia Virginia's actual text of the proclamation, which most people probably haven't had a chance to read. We have a very deep well of primary documents, so we'd like to show those off. But talk a little bit about the effect, not only what you believe were the effects of Lord Dunmore's proclamation, but kind of the surprising way, not surprising way, but the hidden way that Black activists really brought that to bear, not Lord Dunmore imposing that on African-American people.
Oh, I really appreciate that last point you make, and I will come to that. First of all, just thank you for the word kaleidoscope, because I said mosaic a minute ago, which is sort of a synonym, but yours is so much better because it's in motion. So here's the motion with respect to African Americans. Let's start with the most clear piece of evidence we can find for why white colonists went from merely protesting what Parliament was doing with respect to taxes, territory, trade, and treasury notes. They were protesting, but they didn't want independence in 1763, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, all the way up till 1774. Even in Virginia, which was one of the more radical colonies, people did not want independence until late in the game. All they wanted to do was go back to how things had been in 1762 before Parliament. I kind of wish I'd called the first section of my book Parliament's Rebellion, because it's Parliament that rebelled against the status quo that existed at the end of the 7 Years' War. That, by the way, is the other reason I started with the 7 Years' War, because it's the great victory in the 7 Years' War that unleashed Parliament to make all of these changes, to start levying taxes on the colonies, to restricting the trade. That's mostly about molasses smuggling to Pennsylvania and states up from and colonies up from there. But it was the end of the 7 Years' War and not having to get colonial aid against the French that allowed the British to take all these initiatives. But you really need, one way I put it is, as soon as you ask the question, why did the colonists rebel? You're lost, because the colonists didn't choose to rebel. It's Britain, Parliament, that rebelled against the status quo, tried to change all these things. And this, I'm getting to your question, because up until 1774, the colonists were playing defense. They just wanted to put things back the way they had been before. So this raises the question, what happened in 1775 that literally drove them over the cliff from wanting to repair the British Empire to wanting to declare independence from the British Empire? And in the South, certainly not in New England, but in the South, one of the biggest factors was this alliance that the British had made with enslaved people, or to anticipate what you were also saying, that enslaved people had made with the British. And a good place to look for that is in the Declaration of Independence, where the white colonists rebelling on July 2nd is the day they actually had done it. But they declared 2 days later why they had done it. And their capstone grievance, in those days, you save the best for last if you're giving a speech or writing an essay like that. Their capstone grievance was, he has excited domestic insurrection amongst us. Very vague, euphemistic. What the hell does that mean? We know exactly what it means. And that is Dunmore's proclamation that you referred to, that he'd issued on November 15th, 1775. Look at it from the standpoint of the slaveholders. Their governor is supposed to be protecting them from their slaves. There were constant rumors of slave revolts, and that's why you have a governor, to protect you from the Indians whose land you're taking, to protect you from the African Americans whose labor you are taking. And here he is doing the exact opposite of that, as they saw it, leading a slave revolt. What he actually said was, if you're owned by a patriot, he didn't free his own slaves, if you are able and willing to bear arms for the king, and if you can get to me, I will free you. And something like 800 of African Americans joined him just in the first year before the Declaration of Independence, and thousands would, not only in Virginia, but in other colonies as well, before the war was over. But looking at it from the perspective of white Virginians, Archibald Carey from Chesterfield County talked about aiming a dagger at our throats through the hands of our slaves. And actually, it turns out a lot of others use that dagger analogy too. The point is that white Virginians were absolutely furious at Governor Dunmore, and that gives this emotional component to their anger at the crown. And I think they made rational calculations about those initial things, taxes, territory, trade, treasury note. But you need, if you're going to declare independence from a country that you fought for, George Washington fought for his king in the French and Indian War, and it's hard to turn him against the crown and others too. If you're going to turn against that, you need an emotional component, and having your royally appointed king leading a slave revolt, that did the trick. And I'm going to use this chance, Patty, to put in a little plug for something I'm doing on Twitter. I'm putting up 76 quotations from white Virginians expressing their anger at Dunmore's proclamation. And my Twitter handle is @Woody Holton USC.
And I'll drop that in the chat for anyone who wants to take a look at that.
I'd appreciate that. I'd love to see people there, and I'd love to hear their comments too. I'm a little bit of a Twitter addict, so I'll actually answer your question, whether you have a really hostile question or you just want to fill in some information or anything in between. I'd really like to talk to you.
I like how you quote William Byrd III. He called it the damned, infernal, diabolical proclamation. That's really a lot of anger in that.
I'm really glad you mentioned that. I'm not sure that's Byrd. I don't have it in front of me, but the point is, damned, infernal. What do those both mean? They both refer to hell, because Dante's Inferno, that's hell. Diabolical, that's also referring to hell. That's Diablo is the devil. It's amazing how many white Virginians referred to Dunmore as the devil in hell, as devilish. Oh, there's a million different ways to say it, and they, as far as I can tell, they picked all of them to express their anger at him. But then I really want to pick up on something you said, Patty, because I think this is absolutely crucial, because I can get a lot of people as far as we've just gotten in understanding that whites' anger at Governor Dunmore's proclamation helped motivate them to declare independence. Of course, there were many other factors like common sense. And of course, in common sense, Thomas Paine also denounces the British for forming an informal alliance with enslaved people and a formal alliance with Native Americans against the Patriots. So there's lots of other factors too, but this is a crucial one. But here's the next step that I want people watching this afternoon to take with me, and that is, look at the language in the Declaration of Independence. He has excited domestic insurrection amongst us. The clear implication of that is that the slaves were quiet and sitting at home until the British came and instigated them against the colonists. I think that's what whites believed or wanted to believe, but the chronology disproves that. What the chronology that I'm going to give you the short version of does is show that it was the British who got instigated by the slaves. That is, the slaves were the ones who had taken this initiative. And I'm really happy to say, as a biographer of Abigail Adams, she was the first to notice it. And actually up in Boston in September of 1774, more than a year before Governor Dunmore issued his Emancipation Proclamation, she commented that she'd heard, and she may have been wrong, but who cares? Because people are motivated by what they think is happening, not by reality itself. She heard that a group of Black Bostonians who were enslaved had gotten up a petition to Governor Gage, who I mentioned before. By 1775, he was commander-in-chief of British forces in America, and he was also governor of Massachusetts at that point. These Black Bostonians had petitioned him in September of 1774, give us muskets, promise us our freedom, and we will enlist in the British Army because we know you need people. And just a couple months after that, James Madison in Virginia, he reported in a neighboring county that a group of Blacks had met together to choose a leader who would lead them when the English troops arrived. This was almost a year before the English troops actually did arrive in Virginia in any significant numbers, a few people, but before there were any battles or anything, a year before that, African Americans were plotting, and it all culminated in April 1775, when you had more rumors of slave revolts than any other period of Virginia's history before or after the Revolution. And 2 men in Norfolk, I'm very sad to say, were executed for leading a slave revolt. And who knows if they really were, but whites thought they were, so they killed them. And then at the end of that week in April 1775, Governor Dunmore took the gunpowder out of the powder magazine in what we now call Colonial Williamsburg. And I'm so glad to be talking to fellow Virginians, because I don't have to explain that building. We all had to go there in 11th grade or at some point. It's that, I think it's hexagonal, it looks like a pyramid brick building, one of the few buildings that actually, public buildings in Colonial Williamsburg that's actually from that era, not a reconstruction. He took the gunpowder. The whites thought that he had deliberately disarmed them amid this swirl of rumors of slave revolt in order to leave them vulnerable to the slaves. So they threatened him, and then he threatened back, saying, if you touch a hair on my head, I will, quote him, declare freedom to the slaves and reduce the town of Williamsburg to ashes. And what white Virginians repeatedly said to Governor Dunmore, I'm thinking of a Sussex County petition in particular, Surrey County petition in particular, was he had really made them mad by taking the gunpowder, but he made them a lot madder by threatening to free the slaves. All of that's in April of 1775. Knocking on my computer, because that's what a couple of African Americans did, was come and knock on the door of the governor's palace in Williamsburg and said to Governor Dunmore through one of his own slaves, we're here, we've heard about your threat, we're ready to fight for you. He turned them away, and he said if they came back that he would have them whipped. But they kept coming. They and other enslaved Virginians approached the British. One guy named Joseph Harris in Hampton, who was an enslaved harbor pilot, reached a British Navy officer and signed on to the British Navy, got his freedom, and in the next 2 months, twice saved his captain from capture by the Patriots. In all these ways, in the spring and summer of 1775, African Americans showed their value to the British. And so this has been too long, but there's a point, and that is Governor Dunmore's Emancipation Proclamation was the culmination of all of that. And so I want to slip into the National Archives with Nicolas Cage someday and alter the Declaration of Independence to make that one line more accurate, which is the British didn't instigate the slaves instigated the British.
I think that is a really fascinating, that really does kind of flip your understanding of history in a good way, right? It really does create a story that everyone is taking part in. And we've talked a little bit about how Native Americans influenced the revolution and African Americans. So let's talk about women in the revolution. My favorite story, I think, is the story of how Thomas Jefferson basically plagiarized Esther Reed. So maybe you can talk about that a little bit.
I would love to. So after the phrase that we all love in the Declaration of Independence, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. After that, which we all, I certainly adore, that one of the things that Jefferson's most famous for after that is his description of the United States as an empire of liberty. It's a lovely phrase, and also kind of gets at the ambiguity, because we think of the Roman Empire, no liberty there except for a few Romans. So can you actually have an empire of liberty? And he thought you could. And I'm going to get to Esther Reed, but let's start and go backwards. He wrote that in December 1780 to George Rogers Clark in a letter where he was sending Clark to go capture Detroit. We know that Boston, New York, and Philadelphia, and Williamsburg, and Norfolk were big cities. Charleston, South Carolina, where I live near now, those were important cities in the Revolutionary War, but so was Detroit. The British Fort Detroit, the Native American towns around there were the centerpiece of Native resistance against white colonists taking the Indians' land. And the British were there at Detroit handing out arms and ammunition, as in Williamsburg. That's the key thing. You've got the fighters, but are they going to be armed or not? So December 1780, Jefferson sends Clark out there to try to capture Detroit. to get ahead of the story, there were about a dozen efforts on the part of the rebel colonists like Jefferson to capture Detroit. They never did. In a sense, the Indians won the war in the West. But to go back to that phrase, that beautiful phrase, Empire of Liberty, I have a friend who's kind of a friend of me too, named Gordon Wood, the most honored historian of the American Revolution we have, won the National Humanities Medal and so forth. He entitled one of his books, Empire of Liberty. So it's kind of out there as this great phrase of Jefferson's. And my one beef with Gordon about that is that he doesn't say that's where Jefferson got the phrase, is from this letter that's all about Indians. And so Indians are part of that story of Empire of Liberty. But so is, as you mentioned, Esther Reed. Who is she? Let me take you back now. That was December of 1780. Go back to May of 1780 was the real low point of the Revolutionary War for the Patriots. They lost Charleston, South Carolina on May 12th, 1780, along with more than 5,000 Continental soldiers who had been trying to defend it. They were having mutinies in the Continental Army, understandably so, because the soldiers were not being paid and not even given their basic clothing and food allowances and all that. And so the paper money had gone through this massive inflation. So George Washington said something that many people associate with Weimar Germany, that it takes a wheelbarrow full of money just to buy a basic day's worth of supplies, because the money had depreciated so much. In that period of the real low point of the war, Esther Reed, who was married to the highest elected official in Pennsylvania, decided to do something to try to shore up the soldiers' morale. And her idea was for the women of Philadelphia to go knock on doors and get to every single house in what was already the largest city in the rebel colonies, about 35,000 people, go knock on every single door in that town and raise money and then pool it all together and divide it up among the soldiers in the Continental Army. Each one would get $2, which was a ton of money. These were Spanish dólares, not like our dollars, a significant amount of money. She knew that, particularly for upper class women like her, going out into the streets and knocking on strangers' door that's not a ladylike thing. This isn't me talking, by the way, but in the 18th century, that was seen as a not ladylike thing to do. So she knew she had to defend that before even people attacked it. So she wrote this great pamphlet called Sentiments of an American Woman. And she just pointed to precedent. That look at all the things women have done. I think she mentioned, she does mention Joan of Arc. She mentions Elizabeth I, who was Shakespeare's queen. She mentions Catherine the Great, a contemporary of hers, of Esther Reed's, who was the Empress of Russia. And she's, in referring to Elizabeth and Catherine, Esther Reed said they extended the Empire of Liberty. Up till that time, no one had used that phrase except to talk about heaven. That was a nice way to refer to heaven. But she brought it down to earth, and she sent a copy of that pamphlet to Thomas Jefferson. And in fact, he got a couple of different copies of it. And I don't have quite proof that I could take to court. And I should say, by the way, plagiarism was a lot less looked down upon in those. Everybody did it. But I'm pretty sure that Jefferson got that expression, Empire of Liberty, from Esther Reed.
And it's interesting, he felt no need to attribute that to her, obviously. Maybe in some cases, someone would say, as my good friend said, but he did not attribute that.
And in fairness, John Adams produced this dreadful 3-volume book called Defense of the Constitution of the United States. It was mostly an attack on the constitutions of the states before the U.S. Constitution. Most of it was copied and pasted from other places. I don't want my students to hear this, but in those days, everybody did it.
Everybody did. The reason that story had a lot of resonance for me is, you say, overall, independence appeared to have brought women more pain than progress. You noted that the number of casualties among women probably approached the number of casualties among men, about 35,000. In both cases, mostly from disease and other effects of war, not actually from bayonets and bullets. And it seems very much that women, when their support was needed, as you say, in the low point of the revolution, they were encouraged to be these Republican citizens. But as soon as the revolution was won, then women were kind of put back into their, don't go out in public, don't do anything. It just seems a woman did not fare well. Obviously, they were not noted in the Declaration of Independence. Abigail Adams famously asked John Adams to remember the ladies. They were not remembered. So they just, of all the groups, it does not seem that women had much to gain in the short run, but you do talk about how both for women and for abolitionists in the 19th century, they're the ones who give the Declaration a new resonance as their movements take up the words and try to make those real. So can you talk a little bit about how those groups really helped bring about that more perfect understanding of the both the revolution and the Declaration of Independence?
It was a huge contribution. Before I talk about it, let me say something briefly about that 35,000 figure. That is a very rough estimate on my part, just based on impressionistic observations that, for instance, Abigail Adams had a brother-in-law, one of John's brothers, who died of a terrible dysentery epidemic during the in 1775 while he was serving as a Continental soldier. But that dysentery leapt across the line between the army camps and civilian life. And of course, there are lots of women also serving in the army camps, saving lives just by washing shirts, because lice from your shirt are giving you typhus, the #2 killer after smallpox of the Continental soldiers. But so she lost her brother-in-law, but that also jumped over and killed one of her servants, nearly killed one of her kids, and just heartbreakingly for her, killed her mother. And I've seen lots of these other cases too. Nobody counts the number of women who died in the Revolutionary War. Of course, people are dying naturally all the time, but who died as a result of the Revolutionary War. And that would be the case with epidemics like that one of dysentery, because it was stirred up. So was smallpox. Elizabeth Finn does have estimates for men as well as women on the smallpox deaths, and it's much more than the set. It is amazing. 7,000 guys on the American side were shot and killed in the Revolutionary War. That's fewer than died at Gettysburg in 3 days. 7,000 died in 7 years. But when you add in all of those who died on prison ships, both sides did prison ships, but the British did it more, and those who died of disease stirred up by the war, it gets to 35,000 for men, and I think it's something very close to that for women. That's my next project, is to try to go pick through the parish registers and get a more precise number about that. But anyway, I'm really glad you asked this question about, I've been making the case that Native Americans and African Americans helped get us to the Declaration of Independence. What they got us to on July 2nd, when Congress declared independence, was a breakup letter. I mean, you can see it in the name, Declaration of Independence. We're separating 13 parts of the British Empire from the rest of it. They framed it actually as, they didn't use this language, but this was sort of clear, implicit in what they're saying in the Declaration of Independence. We're breaking off an alliance. We have been allies of Britain, these colonies from New Hampshire down to Georgia, and now we're gonna sever that alliance. And then here's the key part that goes with that: we're going to create a new alliance with France. And actually, Congress thought if they could get independence declared fast enough, then they would have a French Navy in American waters by August of 1776. In that goal of breaking up with the British in order to form this new alliance with the French, the Declaration of Independence, we have to confront the fact that it failed. It did not bring the French into an alliance with the colonies. That didn't happen until February of 1778. And that Navy, French Navy, it came, but not because of the Declaration of Independence. It came in the summer of 1778, 2 years later. So I know it's a provocative thing to say because we're so proud of, as we should be, of Jefferson, but what are we proud of? We're not proud of what he said. No one even remembers the language he used to describe the breakup with Britain. What we remember is all men are created equal and certain unalienable rights. And here's a fun bar bet question. Who was the first person to quote that now iconic sentence of the Declaration of Independence? The answer is, the first person ever to quote that was Lemuel Haynes, who was a free black man, a white mother, a black father, so he's considered of color, person of color, mixed race. At the time, he was serving in the Continental Army. Even though he was free himself, he hated slavery, of course. He wrote a pamphlet against that. And then he used, from the freshly printed Declaration of Independence, he used that phrase, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal," and the rest of it, to head off his pamphlet. And so there's your answer. The very first person to quote the Declaration of Independence was a free black guy writing an anti-slavery pamphlet. And then Eric Slaughter, a professor at the University of Chicago, looked, well, okay, well, who are the other first few people to quote it? And a student of mine, a research assistant who is amazing, has done, as a subset of my on my Twitter site, a thread called hashtag Lemuel Haynes Project, Lemuel Haynes Project. And what she's showing in that is that the answer is, how many more people quoted the Declaration of Independence, the Equality Clause, for the rest of the 18th century? Only 27. Of those 27 people who quoted all men are created equal up until 1799, the end of the century, of those 27 people who quoted it, 8 were not abolitionists. The other 19 people who quoted the phrase that we now all cherish in the Declaration of Independence were all abolitionists. Lemuel Haynes, Benjamin Banneker, as well as white abolitionists like those wonderful Pennsylvania Quakers who came out against slavery before hardly anybody else, white. African Americans have been against it from the beginning, but the Quakers were the first white group to really oppose it on a grand scale. Here's what they did. By quoting all men are created equal, those abolitionists and then later women's rights advocates shifted the spotlight of the Declaration of Independence, shifted its emphasis, and what they did was turn an ordinance of secession that Congress had adopted into a universal Declaration of Human Rights. So that I now live in South Carolina, teach here at the University of South Carolina, and there were 2 sisters that I know you know, Patty, but not everybody does, Sarah and Angelina Grimke, who quoted the Declaration of Independence in their advocacy, both for opposing slavery. Yeah, these are white South Carolinians opposing slavery and also advocating women's rights. And they quoted the Declaration of Independence in doing that. And it all culminates in 1848 in the Seneca Falls Declaration of Sentiments, the first real official meeting of declaring women's rights. And how does that phrase open? We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal. Lincoln finished the job at Springfield in the Lincoln-Douglas debates and then at Gettysburg, but it was really African Americans and white abolitionist allies and then women's rights advocates who made the Declaration of Independence no longer a secession document, but a universal Declaration of Human Rights, and no longer unsuccessful, because it had failed at getting the French there, but as the most successful freedom document that I think the world has ever seen.
And let's shift gears a little bit and kind of talk about some of the current debates around history and the revolution. You have been accused, you mentioned Gordon Wood of, I don't know if accused is the right word, but you've been called an activist historian. Now, I'm not sure that implies the existence of stasis historians who don't want to question anything. I don't know about that. But do you consider yourself an activist historian? How would you define? I guess you could define activist historian however you want, but what do you say to that you're an activist historian?
Well, I should say it's a start, since he's not here, that we debated last Saturday up in Boston, and the audio of that is available, masshis.org, the Massachusetts Historical Society hosted that debate, and somebody screwed up the video, but you can hear the audio and hear his side.
And I'll put that in the chat for everyone.
Oh, I appreciate that very much. Oh, and hey, while you're at it, if you got a second, will you do hashtag Lemuel Haynes Project?
All right.
I'm putting you to work, which
I have to figure out how to spell that one. All right, keep talking.
Oh, yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. Lemuel is Lemuel, and Haynes is with a Y. I'll look at it and see. I should have mentioned that before, but anyway, what the heck were we talking about, Patty?
We're talking about if you're an activist historian.
Oh, right, activist. So here's the claim that Gordon Wood made in that debate, that he accused people like me and Nicole Hannah-Jones, who's the creator of the 1619 Project, which, by the way, people don't know this, that's going to be a book that comes out on November 16th. But he accused us of being of trying to find a usable past, that is to promote what he acknowledges is a noble goal of racial reconciliation and racial justice and other kinds of justice in the modern era. He says, you guys are so starry-eyed about creating justice in the present that you are making up things about the past. And that's the phrase usable past. And I completely reject the idea of a usable past, because if you lie to people, or even if you exaggerate or say something without evidence, and people later find out, if I say, and actually somebody did this, there was a book called Black Athena, and it was making interesting argument for North African influences on the Greeks and Romans. So it's kind of a cool book, but I've heard people take that too far and say, actually, I've not heard this. I've heard something like this. Make it easy. Suppose I said, did you know Socrates was actually from Senegal? No one knows that. And isn't that cool? And doesn't that mean we should respect each other more today or whatever? And then you find out that he wasn't really from Senegal. So I kind of see Gordon's point. Yet you don't want to push the evidence, or you don't want to get out over your skis, to use the modern cliche. My response to Gordon on Saturday, and my response to you, and I appreciate you raising it, is go to my website. Go to my Twitter feed, because in each case I have these 76 quotes of whites angry at the British for their alliance with the slaves that the slaves had initiated. And for each quote, I have the quote, but then I also have a photograph of the original document that I took it from. So I just hate the idea of a usable past. You really get yourself in trouble when you do that. But I think we all have our biases. Yes, I am very excited about this discovery that I didn't make. That if anybody made it, it was the African-American historian Benjamin Quarles back in 1961, who really noticed that Blacks were fighting on both sides, and they weren't loyal to the British, they weren't loyal to the Americans, they were loyal to the principle of freedom. And then I'm excited about Eric Slaughter's discovery that those freedom seekers helped make our Declaration of Independence what it is today. I'm excited about it. So yeah, probably at this point, it would be hard to dislodge that from me. But those of you who are still undecided about that, look at the evidence, decide for yourself.
I think that's a great answer. I just want to note we're going to have some time for questions. So if people do have questions for Woody, please drop them in the Q&A and we'll get to those. And to follow up on this, and this is going a bit into the historiography of this era, but you call your subtitle The Hidden History of the American Revolution. And of course, all historians, I don't want to say they use facts selectively. That's what you and Hannah Nicole Jones have been accused of. Everyone uses facts. You pull them together into a narrative and you make a story, and that is how you write history, really. You can't put all the facts in. You have to put in what's relevant to your story. But which I find fascinating, is that some of these things were known at the time. People knew some of these elements at the time. Abigail Adams mentioned this. So as I see it, you're really making things visible that have maybe been forgotten over time as well.
Absolutely. I think the things that I'm talking about in Liberty is Sweet are hidden now, but they weren't hidden then. There's a lot of ways in which people were more sophisticated then than now. One topic we didn't get to, and I'm kind of glad we didn't because it's pretty dry, is paper money. Mm-hmm. Who determines the official government paper supply, money supply of the United States today? The vast majority of us don't know that. I didn't know it until fairly recently, but it's not the Federal Reserve. It's something called the Federal Open Market Committee, which is partly appointed by the president, but partly appointed by the bankers, by private bankers. That's what the law says, is that these guys get to choose who determines how much money our government puts in circulation. And I'm not saying they're doing a good job, I'm saying, or a bad job. I'm not saying it's a good idea or a bad guy to let bankers choose our money supply for us, but people don't know that. And in the 1776, you could ask anybody who determines how much money is circulating here in Pennsylvania. They'd say, why the Pennsylvania legislature, of course. So we can get arrogant and think we know better than they did, but there's lots of examples where they knew better than we do.
And it is fascinating to see how these arguments, and these issues of debtors and creditors and money supply, that comes roaring back in the late 18 teens again, in the Jacksonian era. It's so fascinating to see how these arguments repeat in history so often. I think that people forget that we've been through a lot of these arguments before.
Absolutely. Can I pick up on what? And if you've got a question ready, I'll stop and do that.
Go ahead, and then we'll get to a question. Yeah. Go ahead.
Okay. I can't resist, since you were talking about the hidden history. I mentioned that my prologue. I want to remind myself that I got that right. My prologue. Oh, I said hidden enemy, invisible enemy. You can see why I made the mistake, because hidden is in my subtitle. But it was the quote from referring to the Native Americans who won the battle of Monongahela in 1755 was an invisible enemy. But the reason I'm holding up my cover is, yes, to plug my book, but also look at the picture there. Yes, so forget about my book. Look at the picture. You see one guy standing on his feet has a pistol, and he's holding up these two other guys, and you can tell by their red coats that they are British couriers carrying a message in South Carolina, near where I live now. They're going from a town called 96 over to Augusta, Georgia. Anyway, carrying a message from one British officer to another. And the guy standing on his feet is a patriot who's waylaying them, capturing the message, and he's going to go send it to his officer. But if you look at the guy, I'll move my hand. If you look at the guy on his feet a little more closely, you'll see, although dressed in men's clothing, that guy is no guy. That is a woman. This is depicting a real event. It's a zoomed in picture of it, because there's actually two women who waylaid three British couriers, Rachel and Elizabeth Martin. They were sisters-in-law, and they heard about these couriers coming. And you may be able to help me understand, Patty, because I haven't figured this out. I speculated in the book. Why did they feel they needed to put on men's clothing to do this? Because they had the pistols. That's what made the guys stop. That's how they got the messages. My speculation was that maybe they feared that if they came dressed only as themselves, and even if they were holding a pistol, the men might not have taken them seriously, and they probably really weren't going to shoot them. And so the guys would, oh, come on, little lady, but because they were dressed as men, maybe that would add to the intimidation.
Or they were going to get their clothes dirty because their skirts would have dragged in the mud, and it would be messy. And it was much more practical to dress as a woman. That's all.
Those women's dresses were not meant for travel.
They were not meant to be practical. So I'm just throwing that out there. I don't know.
Yeah.
All right. So let's get to a few questions. This one, I think, is a really fascinating question, and something that I kept coming back to. You see Jefferson as governor of Virginia during the Revolution is kind of like using the cover of the Revolution to move Indians out of places where they would like to grab land after the war is over, hopefully. Someone asks, can you speak about the land grab after the French and Indian War by George Washington and others? Did real estate interests play any role in the Revolutionary War?
Yes. The short answer to that question is yes. Now, much more so in some places than other, but in no place more than in Virginia, where it would be very hard. Actually, consulting the Encyclopedia Virginia, you could find one, because there are so many great people described in there. But you got to go way down into some pretty obscure names before you can find a leader of the Revolution in Virginia who was not a big land speculator. It's Patrick Henry, it's James Madison, it's George Washington. It's one of the big discoveries I made in my first book, Forced Founders, was that Jefferson, who was sort of seen as above all of that, well, he was involved in 7 land speculation ventures before the Revolution. Washington was once described by somebody else's descendant. This guy was interviewed in the 19th century, and he was trying to say what a big land speculator his great-grandfather had been. And he was straining for a way to make it clear just how big his great-grandfather had been into land speculation. And he said, oh, I know how I'll say it. He was as great a landmonger as General Washington. So George Washington was the gold standard by which other people were judged. And he said, the greatest estates we have in this colony were made by taking up the rich back lands that were thought nothing of in those days, now among the most valuable we possess. Now, it's not actually true that he made his fortune in land. He made it by marrying Martha Dandridge Custis, the wealthiest widow in Virginia, but he wanted to build on that. And I didn't do this in the book, but I would do with you a little bit of psychologizing there, psychoanalyzing there, and say, I think his pride wanted to not just be the gigolo that married up, but he wanted to establish a patrimony. He didn't know when he started this that he was not fated to have children. The fact he doesn't have children later becomes, I think, the biggest reason he was so popular, because no one had to worry about there being a Washington dynasty, as there would be an Adams dynasty in Massachusetts. But anyway, he did well by marrying Martha. He wanted to do better, and had speculated in all this land west of the mountains. And he's not only stealing land from Native Americans, again, all these others were doing that too, but for me, one of the low points of Washington's whole career came early on, when he also tricked his fellow officers from the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War, out of their bounties. He got his brother to come up to him, and as he put it, go in a joking way at first, and talk them out of their land. The great thing about Washington is almost all of his low points came early. That, marrying this rich widow and continuing to write love letters to your best friend's wife during your engagement to Martha Custis. The historian Winsick, I'll remember his first name in a second, in his book about Washington and slavery, Henry Winsick, sorry, Henry points out that Washington not only in his early days auctioned off slaves, he did something worse. A friend who's had a bunch of slaves that he wanted to sell, I think maybe the guy died, and so it was time to turn them into cash. Here's the only thing you can do to an enslaved person that's worse than auctioning their family off, which may split the family, is raffle them off. And they did have raffles, just like we have lotto today. And here's why that's worse: because an auction, it's likely that you're going to be separated from your kids. I have a 12-year-old and a 15-year-old, and even though they're teenagers, I don't want to be separated from them for life. And people lost much younger kids who went off to horrific fates. That might happen in an auction, or there's a small chance that some humane person will buy your whole family. But a raffle is, by definition, random. It randomly distributes, so it's bound to separate families. So there's Washington's lowest low point. But he's also the guy, he's the only major founder in the South who freed all of his slaves. Unfortunately, not until Martha died, and she was worried that they would speed up her death. And so she went ahead and freed them. So it's really Martha who freed those 316 people, I think it was, not George. So give him credit for that. That's a lot better than Jefferson, who didn't free anybody that he wasn't related to. Washington also is the guy who in March of 1783 prevented his fellow officers from engineering a coup d'etat aimed at forcing Congress to pay them pensions that they thought, there was controversy about it, but they thought they'd been promised these pensions and were going to demand the money at the saber's edge. That's the Newburgh conspiracy, that Washington really overturned that. And so look how far he's traveled from. In this around 1763, he's stealing from his fellow officers as well as the Native Americans. Oh, and the enlisted men. That bounty land had been meant for enlisted men, but the officers stole it from. Let's see, Virginia stole it from the Indians. The officers stole it from the enlisted men, and then he stole it from his brother officers. It was a rough.
Nice.
But anyway, here's my point. Washington was a guy in 1763 stealing from his brother officers, but he was a guy in 1783 who prevented his brother officers from doing something terrible. So he continued to own people until the day he died. And like Jefferson, he knew that was wrong. And so we can't say, oh, don't judge them by the standards of the present. Okay, judge them by their own standards. Their own standards were that it was a terrible, terrible evil. And so it's not like he became a great guy in his relationship to African Americans, but he became a better guy in his relationship to officers, in his relationship to his wife, which became a truly loving partnership. And yes, even it's compared to other Virginians, a pretty low slaveholders, a pretty low bar. He's the one who freed them all at his wife's death.
And I think that's a good, this question we'll wrap up with, and I think that's a good lead into this question, because it is a complicated, fascinating legacy of the Revolution, especially in Virginia, because so many of the founders were here and because they traveled such interesting paths. As we approached the 250th anniversary of the Revolution, and we're celebrating that in Virginia, how do you think that Virginia should commemorate the Revolution and think about the Revolution at this point?
Fantastic question. And it brings me back to the question you asked me at the beginning too, about what did I learn about the Revolution as a kid. My first chapter book given to me by my father was a biography of Thomas Jefferson. And if you go to the third floor of the Capitol today in Richmond, they have portraits of, I guess, like the 20 most recent governors. So Dad's almost done because he was governor in 70. It's going to be maybe time for him to head to the basement pretty soon. So get up there quick, because what you'll see is that Dad is holding a biography by Dumas Malone, part of the 6-volume biography that Malone wrote of Thomas Jefferson. But what I want to point out is, and Jefferson, Dad and I did have some disputes about Jefferson, but we ended up agreeing on what I'm about to say, which is which volume did Dad want to be shown? You'd think it might be volume 1, Jefferson the Virginian, but no, he chose Jefferson and the Rights of Man, because what Dad believed in and what most of the people on this call believe in, and you and I do, is the rights of man and woman. And the principles of the Declaration of Independence. To answer your last question, Patty, that's what I think we should be celebrating. We should be remembering Jefferson. He is one of the most fascinating people to me in all of Western history, not just in US history. We should be studying him, but we shouldn't be worshiping him. What I'm perfectly happy with, that loaded religious term worship, I'm happy with that word if we talk about the principles of the Declaration of Independence. And I would say, instead of worshiping heroes, of thinking we found a heroes, because even the people that I like, Abigail Adams, I love her, but man, she wouldn't let 2 of her kids marry the person they wanted to marry, which is exactly what her mother tried to stop her from marrying John. And so anyways, we're all human beings. So let's study the founders as humans. Let's celebrate their heroics, but not try to crown them as heroes.
I think that is a perfect way to wrap up. Thank you so much, Woody. This has been a fascinating conversation. Woody's book is available now. It's called Liberty is Sweet, A Hidden History of the American Revolution. You will learn a lot of things, not only that you didn't know about the Revolution, but new ways to look at things you thought you knew about the Revolution. And also, please consider becoming a supporter of Encyclopedia Virginia. I'm going to drop a link in the chat where you can become a supporter and keep us free and online and presenting programs like this. Thank you everyone for your time today. Thank you especially Woody, and enjoy the rest of your Friday, everyone.
Everybody go browse the Encyclopedia Virginia. It's amazing.
Right. It's a good way to spend a rainy Friday. All right. Thank you so much, Woody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Thanks, guys. Bye-bye.